course of the Commons program. But just in brief, maybe just a quick note on upcoming events. First off, note that unlike in previous years, we do have a colloque during spring break, since we don't have a spring break this year. So we don't want to give short thrift to Rebecca from the CUNY School of Law that week. So do remember on March 15th that we do have another presentation. And the research series continues as well. There will be, I think, just one change coming up to the research series on March 10th. That's currently open. That won't stay open for long. We very well might have an announcement there soon on who will be filling that. But there will be someone. This Wednesday, though, remember that Sasha, our very own Ostrom Fellow from Geography, will be presenting on the role of monitoring and law enforcement on deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. So that's going to be just fantastic. So those are just a couple of quick bookkeeping announcements. The Space Commons Conference, for what it's worth as well, was absolutely fantastic, I thought, late this last week that Marco and IASC took the lead in organizing. And so I think I saw several folks from the workshop on some of those calls. I moderated a session on benefit sharing on Friday, which was just, oh my gosh, nerdy and fantastic. And I have to say that the way they were able to pull that virtual conference together, I think it'll provide some useful lessons for us, especially as we continue to be hybrid. Though it looks like this fall, we'll see, right? Maybe we'll be able to have at least, some of us back in hopefully a new and improved technology-wise Tocqueville room. So something to look forward to there. But for now, let's turn things over. Bill, over to you, good sir, to properly introduce our distinguished speaker for the day. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I know we're all suffering from Zoom fatigue, and we really appreciate it.
So thanks, Scott. Happy to do this. The Space Commons stuff, as well as the AI and cyber stuff, is so great because it allows us, those of us who are longtime workshoppers like Dan and me, to see people who are even dorkier than we are do their work. And so we're grateful. We're grateful for that. The cutting edge is a good thing. It is a great pleasure to have Professor Brigham Daniels as our colloquium speaker today. Professor Daniels is the Francis R. Kirkham Professor of Law at the Brigham Young University School of Law. Has a PhD from Duke and a JD from Stanford. And prior to his work at Brigham Young, Professor Daniels spent some time as director of the State Climate Policy Project at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment, and as co-director of the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston Law Center. He has many and varied publications, of which I'll mention that he's recently contributed chapters to the Routledge Handbook of the Study of the Commons, co-edited by our colleague Dan Cole, and the forthcoming Cambridge Handbook of Commons Research Innovations, co-edited by our friend and fall colloquium speaker, Sheila Foster. I haven't yet seen Professor Daniels' chapter in that new book, but I can attest that his chapter in the Routledge volume titled Commons Storytelling was one of the more enjoyable as well as insightful things that I've read. Today, he shares with us some new work on disaster vulnerability. I'll keep the cue by watching for raised hands in the participants list or notes in the chat. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brigham Daniels. Floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I don't know if you heard me say this, if you just barely hopped on, but this has been, when I was a PhD student at Duke and I studied under Meg McKean, she would talk about the workshoppers, and she talked about the workshop, and it's always been this mystical place that I've wanted to visit, and I'm so glad to do it virtually. I see some friends out there in the audience who I've interacted with you before, but I'm just really glad to have this opportunity and grateful. So thank you for including me. It was very much appreciated. This project that I'm going to talk about, it really is a lot of the work that I had been doing. I either didn't have energy to do once COVID hit, or it was empirical work in the field that got completely blown apart due to COVID. So I had these two different problems. And a colleague of mine named Lisa Gross-Sun does disaster law, and we decided to create a kind of research cohort that we would focus on COVID for the months that we had to suffer through it. And this is one of 5 or 6 projects that will probably come out of that. This is the very first one that we made it across the line. I was working hard to get another one across the line that I think it may have been more on point, but I still think this is very much a appropriate paper to present here. Let me just, if I may, share my screen. Hold on one second here. I'm just going to just go here to the this issue of disaster vulnerability is a lot of people who focus on disasters focus on vulnerability. It is sometimes called the silent killer, and frequently it isn't. You don't realize that vulnerability has been such an issue until they start giving, it's kind of grim, but the body count really identifies that this is a problem. Sometimes it's more visible than others, and this was, these it's actually somewhat appropriate that the photograph on the right is more grainy than the one on the left, because the people on the left are the people who left New Orleans before Katrina hit and had a lot of means. The people on the right, I don't know if this was a bad camera or just a bad picture, but these are folks who had to stick around. And so sometimes we do see, vulnerable people huddled in a football stadium, and we think to ourselves, wow, these folks had to stay. A lot of, you hear stories about why they stayed. But even then, stories come out years later, and this is one kind of factoid that was surprising to me. I saw this slide, Rob Veracek presented this slide a while ago, and it basically deals with the vulnerability of women, who I didn't, if you look at the pictures of Katrina, you didn't realize perhaps that female-headed households were going to be hit so hard. There's a lot of striking statistics here. Maybe the one that hit me the hardest was 2/3 of single moms didn't return to New Orleans. It's also interesting, and we see this happening during the current pandemic, that while a lot of people who are vulnerable to a particular disaster, they're devastated by it. There are many other instances where other people gain, and we see that women's median income fell while men's gained in this particular disaster. So this is a picture of or a map created by the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. And if you haven't ever played around with the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, it's actually pretty cool. But what it does is it allows you to look at the census block scale vulnerability that they have measured, and they haven't measured it for any particular disaster, but these are folks that they generally consider vulnerable due to their social vulnerability. So, for example, the pandemic, right? Asthmatics bear a particular burden in the current pandemic, where they might not in another disaster. So, but socially vulnerable people are frequently hurt when it comes to disasters. We started playing around with we had a team. Our team includes a statistician, an infectious disease expert who is also an expert in GIS mapping, and a few law professors, and another GIS person that has been helping us. And, we started playing around with these maps and just try to figure out, is there something that these can say about COVID? And what we realized is that they weren't doing a very good job at getting at least a lot of what we thought was important. So for example, age, right? I mean, one thing that's kind of unique about COVID is just how visible vulnerability is. Everywhere you go, they say, are you old? Do you have any of these underlying symptoms, right? And we kind of have run through that list enough that vulnerability is like really top of mind. And this map just didn't do it for us, but we realized that unfortunately the pandemic was going to be around for a while. So we decided to try to create one of our own. This is an example. This is the social vulnerability map that's related to COVID. It's done on the county level. A lot of the data that we would have really loved to have is not available at the census block level. The reason for it is largely privacy in rural counties. So there, in larger cities, you can get some of this. But in at least across the country, there's a lot of data that's just not available at the county level. The darker that the county is shaded, the more vulnerable it is. The other thing that so there's a lot of social vulnerability indexes, like the social vulnerability index created by the CDC. They basically give all factors equal weight, and unfortunately, the pandemic has gone on long enough that we've been able to try to figure out what is doing the most work. In other words, what is making people vulnerable at the county level. And this is a map that basically shows you the different kinds of vulnerability that are causing problems across the country. The thing that is most interesting here, to me anyway, is you can see that there are some counties that are shaded darker. Those darker shades are the most vulnerable counties in the country. And one of the things that's really striking to me is if you look at the color of them, by and large, they're blue, and that's race. It's interesting, isn't it, as we think about what's going on. Every time you see these, this is doing, so in other words, race is doing more. It's a better predictor in most of these counties of whether or not your COVID mortality than even underlying medical conditions or age or, and the most vulnerable counties are almost entirely blue. Not completely, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are also this lighter shade of orange, essential workers, which is, that's a social income for the most part. So here's what we've done with this. We've basically tried to take this and tried to reinvent. If we had this information in time, what could we have done with it, this geographical vulnerability? And in the paper, we applied this to two different problems, mask mandates and the election. I'm just going to show you the election. This was very startling to us. And the same thing comes up with masks, actually. This map is shaded according to the counties that are in the most vulnerable decile of all counties. And then the colors represent the voting scheme. Red being the states that did the very least to accommodate COVID. Orange counties did quite a bit. They actually allowed for all people to vote by mail, but they didn't do anything to really advertise it or didn't do much. And then the ones that are in yellow, they did quite a bit to advertise. Like they either sent a absentee ballot application to every person, or they actually just made all voting by mail. One of the things that's interesting, if you look at this, there's only 5 states in the country that didn't have vote by mail. And one of the things that is so interesting to me is I think it's close to close to 35 to 40% of the counties that are in the most vulnerable. They're in are in how should I say this? 35 to 40% of the counties are in those 5 states. I mean, the top decile, and this actually, these counties, particularly throughout the South, they do mirror quite a bit the counties that used to get a lot more protection under the Voting Rights Act. We're actually writing another paper about the Voting Rights Act and this particular phenomenon here. But okay, the last, this is, we don't have a lot of vaccine data yet. There are 5 places that we have found that are providing vaccine data by zip code, and a lot of counties aren't reporting it at all, just statewide totals. But Chicago is one of these places, along with New York and Phoenix and San Diego, that are reporting this by zip code. And one of the things that's interesting here, if you look at the places where we've had a lot of vaccinations, it doesn't map very well with the places that have had a lot of cases, nor that have had a lot of deaths, which suggests that we still have lessons to learn. And as we're rolling out the vaccine, there may be some other issues going on. Now, this one, I kind of think about it in my own context. I have been angling to get my parents vaccinated, and I have been watching very, very closely every announcement, and 5 minutes within it opening, I was one of the people in my state who helped crash the website to get my father on a list. There may be some of this that just a lot of the most vulnerable people may not have that kind of access or ability or time or whatever it is. But one thing that is interesting, I think is worth noting, we talk about 2 other kinds of vulnerability, and one of them is thinking about, we challenge people not only to think about vulnerability geographically, but we also challenge people to think about vulnerability in the context of one of the problems we've seen in COVID is how do we prioritize different kinds of vulnerability? So should the old people go first, or should the essential workers go first, for example? And then a third kind of vulnerability is a political vulnerability. And one of the things that's just, I think, needs to be said, and I won't take a lot more of your time on this, but this is a picture of the ruins of Chinatown after, or San Francisco after the Great Earthquake in the early 1900s. And it was just, it was very, 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 very close. It was a very, very close call for the folks who had shops in Chinatown. One of the things that was considered and actively debated and almost executed on was the idea of relocating Chinatown outside of the city of San Francisco. Chinatown did not form organically. Chinatown was formed largely by just society not allowing people, whether through informal or formal means, to live outside of Chinatown. But once everything was leveled and people had to start over, they started looking at Grant Avenue in San Francisco and said, boy, this would be a great place for my shop or whatever. So one of the things to note about this is, some of this stuff, it does appear to be perhaps accidental, but we do have quite a long history of people taking advantage of vulnerable people in times of disaster. I'm happy to open this up to conversation, but this kind of gives you an overview of the project, and I'll stop sharing my screen now so I can see your faces when you talk.
Thanks so much, Brigham. Really appreciate that. Again, you're welcome to either use the raise hand function under the participants button, or to use chat and just say, I have a question, and you don't have to type your question in. You can just say, I have a question, and I'll keep the queue that way. I've already got Gustavo and Jamie in the queue, and then you're welcome to chime in after them. Gustavo, please go first.
Okay, hi, thanks. I have a very simple question, almost a clarification question. Could you talk a little bit more about what kind of definitions of vulnerability you are using? Because again, we are talking about different. So let's say with COVID, are we talking about probability of dying, probability of losing your job due to COVID? They are very different things, and I believe it's a little bit more clarification would be useful, at least for me.
Thank you, Gustavo. I appreciate that. So we are focused on the things that are causing mortality. So, and what we basically have done is we have tried to find a whole bunch of different kinds of anytime we find a descriptor that we say asthmatics, for example, we'll find at the county level rates of asthma. So there were some things that were harder to find than others. But we to the extent the CDC or others had data of any kind of vulnerability, whether or it could also be census block stuff, so age or whatever. We try to factor that in, and then what we ask the model to do is we allow the model to basically tell us which one of these factors in a particular county would have done the best job at predicting predicting mortality, both the extent to which and which kinds of mortality are, what are the causes, the causal factors of mortality that are doing the most work. Now, Gustavo's question here is a good one though, because I don't think we don't really. It's hard to get at all the various kinds of ways that people are vulnerable, whether that's being in or out of school. People might define either one of those as causing a certain kind of vulnerability, losing your job. But these things also may be interrelated too. So it wouldn't surprise me if a fair number of people who end up losing their job are also the people that have experienced mortality because they don't have insurance or some other reason. We did look at insurance rate, the percentage of people insured, but it's hard to get that in real enough time to really figure out what's going on with the virus.
Can I have a quick follow-up here?
Sure.
So within mortality, I don't know the details, but I know that there is a huge discussion between people focusing on mortality and then expected years that you are protecting with different policies, for example. Do you think that your analysis would make a difference if you pick one variable versus the other, or essentially the counties that you're identifying as vulnerable, they will be pretty much the same?
Well, I think that for this particular disease that they're going to be fairly similar. And the reason I think that is, we've played around with different kinds of measurements of what we're trying to measure. So we ended up focusing on mortality, but we could also think about case fatality. So the percentage of people who die who end up having cases. You could also, one of the other parameters of the model is, because we're pushing data into the model of people who died under a certain period, you can change the dates that the model takes into account. And as far as figuring out which of the counties should be in that top decile. And anytime we've played around with the model, we have seen slight variations, but for the most part, I think that our map here, at least, if you're trying to answer the question, which is the question that we were trying to ask originally when we started thinking about voting, which counties will be the most dangerous places to vote? If you were going to go vote, where is it the most dangerous to do so? And that's just sort of that was the first question we asked. But I do think it would be quite similar. Although, I mean, I think there would be variation around the edges for sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Brigham. I've got Jamie up next, followed by Daphne and Jess.
Hi, thanks so much for your interesting work. It's been fun to learn more about. I have a question related to like the maps of vulnerability.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused because in the geographical maps of the country, and you even talked about this in your presentation about how a lot of counties in the South were more vulnerable.
Yeah.
You know, when it comes to voting rights and to like the types of things that make people vulnerable. But when it came to your COVID map, instead of continuing to refer to the South, you used Chicago. And I think that I find that I don't, you know, what's the purpose behind that? Because, you know, I think like if we're going to look at these areas that are most vulnerable in terms of county, that we would also want to continue the trend of you know, if we're talking about the South, then continue talking about the South in terms of COVID.
Yeah.
But also before you answer, I just want to say, I think
Yeah.
it's great that you're looking at the county level because so often we don't do that. And I think that's where some really interesting things happen.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. So one of the reasons we looked at Chicago, well, it was really a matter of practicality. And the first of which is which counties were reporting vaccination rates, right? And there weren't any in the South that are giving us vaccination data, at least on the zip code level, so we could break it down more. And I think that we just wanted to have fewer places, and we didn't want to introduce the CDC social vulnerability index more than necessary in explaining how it's different than ours. But I do agree that if, you know, if we could find, you know, it very well may be that by the time this paper is published, we have great data from Houston or some other place. And I think that you're right that I would have loved to have focused on a county that was surrounded by very vulnerable places. Cook County is, I think, on our list, but it's, you know, like a lot of, I'm not sure it's in the top decile. I have to look. I mean, like a lot of cities, county level data doesn't do a really great job at describing what's going on because you can have very, very wealthy people and very, very poor people, and they both live in Cook County. And so this would be one place where, I mean, it's one of the reasons we wanted to drill down with the social vulnerability data in a particular place like a city was to show, you know, there may be some lessons here as well but you're right, a southern city would be much better for some of our examples.
Well, and I have a follow-up thought too, because so many of the counties that were most vulnerable in the South weren't even southern cities. They were rural areas.
Yeah, a lot of them are rural.
If you're going to talk about vulnerability of those most vulnerable places, then you need to make sure that you distinguish between rural and city. And what I know, I'm also from Oklahoma too, so I'm quite familiar with Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico area. And what I see on the map anyways is you've got a couple counties in eastern Oklahoma. You've got a lot of western Texas with the Panhandle and a lot of places in New Mexico. I'm not sure like why West Texas is necessarily considered more vulnerable because I know you've got a mix of poor and wealthy people there. But the Oklahoma counties look like they align with where Indian reservations are.
Yeah.
And in New Mexico, you probably have the same thing happening there.
Yeah.
So those are really important details that are going to change what your study looks like.
Right. Well, and I mean, you know, one of the things that we have done, I put in a link and it's not working that well. I was going to show it to you today. We have a dashboard that would basically allow you to look at counties by various, you know, there were a bunch of assumptions made when we made our map. And what we basically did is we let the data tell us which vulnerability to focus on in a particular county and which counties to focus on depending on mortality rates. But when we first started out with this, like we had 3 different vulnerability indexes. We had a social vulnerability index. We had we had a age vulnerability index, and we had a kind of underlying health factors vulnerability index. And we're trying to figure out which of those to choose. And ultimately we just decided to let the numbers take us where they were. But I do agree there is a rural bias of some of this data. And part of the reason I think is because there's great variation in cities. I think if we were to do this, if we had enough data to do this, the census block, I think that a lot of the most vulnerable census blocks very well may be in cities that we're skipping over. That's a very good point, Jamie. Thank you.
Thanks. Daphne, you're up.
Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's also extremely timely. And I had just a brief clarification question. So it's a question about the COVID vulnerability map of the US that you have shown us. And you had basically categories of age, race, whether or not one was essential workers, and then this big category of other. And so my question basically is about this big category of other. Could you unpack it a little bit for us? Because such categories, they often like hide a lot of neat details in them.
Sure, thank you. Well, a lot of this will depend, would be underlying health conditions. If that was, it turns out though, I mean, these are all kind of messy because you could have somebody who's old, who has an underlying health condition, who is also a racial minority, right? Some people can satisfy multiple risk factors, but the other, for the most part, is going to be things like obesity rates, do they smoke, heart disease, rates of asthma. Those are some of the bigger movers. But we probably have, they're listed out in the paper. I would say there's probably 8 or 9 kind of health variables that we're looking at.
Thanks, Brigham. Jess?
Okay, sorry, I wouldn't unmute. Hi. So like everybody else, I'm super impressed. It's a lot of work and incredibly timely. I have a small technical question and then a sort of broader question. The technical one has to do with whether there would be any reason to incorporate spatial interdependence here, right? So given that we're talking about a pretty communicable disease, right? Vulnerability in one county, I would imagine, is actually, in addition to incredibly predicted by the variables that you have included, but also I would imagine by the variables in neighboring counties, right? Especially when people live in one county and work in another, right? And so I'd be curious to know if that's something that you considered. It seems like you could, there's some, I'm sure your GIS person is available with a variety of the sort of smoothing tools that you can use at sort of county borders that sort of buffer and allow for these sort of weighted spatial interdependence. So that's my first sort of technical question. And my broader question is more about how we think about using this. So you said that a lot of this came sort of, you first started putting this together in the summer of 2020. At that point, we had a fair amount of information, impressively so, I think. Yeah. And so I don't really, I actually don't, initially I was like, oh, well, it seems like it's possible that things have changed since then. And could we worry that some of these predictors are not accurate? But I actually think they might be relatively stable at this point, honestly. Yeah. My broader question has to do though with how much of this, so is the thought that we would consider using this for policy interventions in counties that have yet to have major outbreaks or major extremely high rates of mortality? Or is the thought that we could use this as a format or model for future disasters? And if so, a lot of this is COVID specific, right?
Yeah.
A lot of this is about the extent to which
Yeah.
age matters a whole lot, the specific underlying conditions that matter, and the ways even in which socioeconomic vulnerability matters differ, right? Like difference, it's one thing to have limited access to a vaccine, it's another thing to be essential workers, right? And all of those things might matter differently in different kinds of disasters. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, and the final point on that is that if this is really to draw inferences about sort of our past behaviors in the last year, right? And how that corresponds to sort of vulnerability, and what that really amounts to is like how efficient were our strategies, right? How do we, that presumes that if we're going to link vulnerability to these interventions, that either we had some knowledge about level of vulnerability or we had none, at which point, what can we infer about the relationship between a vulnerability in a particular county and the interventions or effects that policy might have? So that's kind of a loaded final question.
There's a lot there. There's a lot there.
I'll stop.
Let me take a couple of those anyway. So yes, we did look at interconnectedness. I think that ultimately we weren't seeing. So we weren't seeing major changes. One thing that we played around with a lot was, what should we do about case counts? And because that's usually the way that COVID risk is actually seen, is case counts. And we do take into account cases to the extent that we're looking at past mortality. I mean, there is a case function in there. But one of the things that we realized is that, whether or not that I don't know if this makes sense, but to the extent that we were trying to thinking about trying to forecast sort of how the disease spreads, we found it very compelling to use this interconnectedness. But if we're just thinking about ultimately mortality as being sort of the measure, we decided that there was some overlap, but that ultimately decided not to include that in the modeling. I would love to. It seems, Jess, that you know quite a bit about this. I'd love to have you talk with one of our modelers about this. If this isn't satisfying, I'd love. I just don't know if I can explain it as well, because I wasn't the one that was doing it.
What you said makes sense, but I would still love to hear more at some other point. We'll let it go.
Okay. The second question that you have is, this is actually a question that a law professor named Dan Farber asked us when he looked at the paper, is what do we do with this, and how can we use this? What can we learn about other disasters? Is this COVID specific? Would, in a lot of other disaster contexts, would you have time to put together something like this so quickly? And those are all very good questions. I think the thing that we were ultimately thinking a lot about using this in real time to try to give policymakers advice. But one of the things that by the time we got this ready, and we actually had it reviewed by people before the election, one of the comments that we got is, policymakers aren't going to have time to make a change in the next month and a half. And the only people who are likely to use this are people who want to suppress the vote. They're going to take your data and say, you live in a dangerous place, don't go vote. So I think that one of the challenges that we've had is trying to figure out uses for this where the prospect of use is higher than the prospect of abuse. I think the vaccination actually is one of those places that prospectively we have a lot to say about vaccination, and particularly, no one is really talking about giving the vaccination to racial minorities first, but there's a lot of conversation about frontline workers, and there's some overlap between those. groups. I think the modeling would show or suggest that in many areas, frontline workers should really be prioritized much more than they currently are. I mean, I don't know. I guess the other kind of question that you had is, I think Dan's question, like, how do we think about this with the context of other disasters? I think it's going to be challenging to use this. You know, I do think that the CDC Social Vulnerability Index is in real-time decision-making when you're dealing with something like a hurricane or a fire or something like that. I think that's probably going to be your best data if you need something immediately. But if there are longer-term disasters, or you can forecast disasters, and I think that this is becoming increasingly common with, for example, climate change. You might be able to think about something like incidents of hurricane in places where you just think they're going to be increasingly vulnerable to hurricanes, and you could start kind of unpacking some of that ahead of time. And there are people who do that, but I don't know if our social vulnerability index would be used outside of the context of a pandemic. I think it would be useful in the next pandemic, but let's hope that it's never used again. I'm sick of this pandemic. Okay, a few other questions.
Thanks. Yeah. So I've got Dan, Jamie, and Tanya in the queue, but I'm going to beg their indulgence to step in front of them just for something that's almost like a follow-up on what Jess was asking. It's not the same as Jess's question, but it triggered this. You make a good case, I think, in the paper for the value of vulnerability indices. But it got me wondering if vulnerability indices were created for a variety of disaster risks, would that help policymakers or overwhelm them?
You're saying if you had a social vulnerability index that was related to fire, and one that's related to hurricanes, and one that's related to pandemics.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we see natural disaster vulnerability maps, they're basically hazard maps, right. and so we're kind of familiar with those. But I am curious about what your own sense, or your colleagues on your team's sense of the capacity of policymakers to take in data like this, especially if there were indices for different topics.
I think in some places it would be too much, but in a place like the United States, I don't think so. I mean, our public health experts, who in most states we've got to learn their names and their faces, and we never knew they existed. They'll go back to obscurity once the pandemic is over, and firefighter chiefs or FEMA personnel or whatever. I think that we have enough people who are worried about a particular kind of risk that if you told people here is something for earthquakes, the policymaker at the very top, the governor or the mayor or the county judge or whatever, or commissioner, might not be able to take it in. But I do believe that sort of the technocrats that assist that person that would be brought into the room could digest it and improve it over time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Now I'll go back to the queue, which is now Dan, Jamie, Tanya, and Brian. Dan, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. I've been trying to think about how best to phrase the question, and I'm not sure, so I might ask it in a couple of ways. One is, have you gone to insurance companies or reinsurance companies for any assistance on how to do this kind of thing? Because I would think they must have some experience with this, or if they don't, they should be really interested in potentially funding this. And then Another way of putting the question is, were you shocked not to find a big literature on this already?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, we have not gone to insurance companies. That's a very interesting question. I do believe that is, this kind of risk leveraging is exactly the sort of thing that insurance companies do, but insurance companies, for the most part, are asked to think about valuable assets instead of maybe perhaps folks that don't have assets, or frequently those are the vulnerable people that we're worried about. That's a very good question, and I think I probably will send this over to some folks in our business school. I'd love to hear what they think about this. It's a very good question. The second question you asked, Dan, can you remind me again?
Yeah, it was just, were you surprised not to find huge literature on this already? I mean, it looks to me, when I look at your maps, my initial thought is, well, John Snow, right, who was doing this one to figure out cholera in London.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is exactly, I mean, these kind of heat maps are used, and I think that they're often used by some expertise in policy, but there is really, as we looked at the legal literature, which is where this audience is, there really is, this is really kind of an anomaly in a lot of ways. So yeah, I think I was surprised, and I'm not sure if that says more about our field of study, Dan, or if it says more about sort of the skills of those in our field. But yeah, even still, I mean, it's surprising to me just, how prominent the case count maps have been. I mean, I don't know about you, but for a period, I was looking at them multiple times each day, I'd go to Johns Hopkins and I'd go to New York Times and I'd try to think about, are they forecasting a different number of cases for the place I live in or where I know people or whatever. It's weird to me that there hasn't been more of this, even just for COVID, where we've kind of thought about, there are other ways to express risk than the one we've become very much ingrained with. So yeah, I have been surprised, actually. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks. We're gonna have to start taking this as more of a lightning round.
Right.
We've got about 10 minutes to go, and I've got 4 people in the queue. Jamie, you're up next, and then Tanya, Brian, and Angie put a question in the chat that I'll ask you to respond to as well. But Jamie, go ahead.
Okay. I have 3 points. I'll make them quick though, but they all fall under this bigger umbrella of the idea of value. And Vincent Ostrom talks about this in his, since this is the Ostrom workshop, obviously, it makes sense to invoke Vincent Ostrom's article, Artisanship and Artifact. And he talks about, even in public administration, every technocrat or bureaucrat or every administration has some sort of thing at stake. It's not a valueless entity. Like, there's always some value that they're striving towards. And so I want to bring this home to the fact that a couple of things have changed throughout this whole COVID process. One is our definitions of words have changed a lot, like the word case, for instance. Pre-COVID and even at the beginning of COVID, case meant a person who was symptomatic who showed up at their doctor's office and was diagnosed or whatever. Case now includes people who are tested and they have asymptomatic markers of having been exposed to COVID without being symptomatic. And so we need to recognize that that definition of case has changed and been expanded. We should ask why. I think that's also an important question. Another thing that we should think about too is how the rules of the game have changed. And I'm thinking about this in terms of voting and voter vulnerability. And I make this comment ignoring the media hype and the personalities associated with these claims to say that, in our last election, we had rules of voting procedures changed, not by people's or by the votes of constitutional change, but by state bureaucrats, whether it was a Secretary of State or what have you. I haven't looked, and it's hard to make that assertion because we know that's been so closely linked to one candidate. And I'm not making that, claim because I support him or anything. I'm actually like removing all that fluff from this aspect and recognizing that whatever you think about him, like there has been an objective rules of the game that have been changed in a way that is anti-public choice. I mean, if you read James Buchanan or Vincent Ostrom, I don't think they would have approved with the way that rule would have been changed. And so the question is, what kind of vulnerability has been introduced? Are we now more vulnerable to rule by tyrants than we have before in our past? Well, actually, those are my points. So next person.
Thank you, Jamie.
Let me go ahead and ask Tanya, and maybe what we'll do is we do sometimes in Colloquium when we start to get down to our final minutes is, Brigham, with your consent, we'll just do these last three questions, or these next three questions, I should say, as a group, and then you can sort of decide in what order to respond to them. So Tanya, could I ask you first to unmute, and then Brian, and then Angie's question is in the chat, and then Brigham, you can respond to them in whatever order time allows.
Yeah, that actually works out perfect because I don't think mine is necessarily like a question, but more a thought that I had as we were talking about the discussion that started with Jess about kind of the implications of this data. And one thing I was thinking about is like, so I'm from South Louisiana, and I lived in South Louisiana when all the hurricanes were happening this past year. And one of the things that I was thinking about, I've been seeing on the media or in the media and on TV lately, like, I mean, there's this big campaign in Louisiana to try and get people out to get vaccinated because nobody wants to get vaccinated here. Like, this is a really big problem. Like, I would be surprised, honestly, if even like a quarter of our population was vaccinated in a timely manner because people are constantly refusing it. So when I'm thinking about implications of the data moving forward, like at least in places like Louisiana where there's this pushback, I foresee COVID being a problem, like, probably far beyond where it is in most places and being a more at-risk place. So I guess like in terms of, so I don't think things are going to be over for us anytime soon. So as implications for the data go, I'm thinking in terms of like, well, maybe like this could be useful for policymakers, understanding where to double down their efforts, maybe for outreach to inform people about the vaccination process, to maybe try and get our numbers up. Just because I kind of see this being a constant problem where more education and more focus is needed, especially in rural places here in the South, because that's where the main issue is. So.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Brian?
Okay. In your map on Chicago, the first point you made is, okay, disparities between where the vaccination is being done and where COVID was severe. But looking at it a little harder, it looked like there was more stuff going on there. And there was actually variation that could be interesting to explore in some places with severe COVID, which were getting more vaccination. So as a question, kind of how could you explore that, including whatever may be going on, including perhaps local government, and including multiple methods, not just, sitting back and looking at this data, but whether you do interviews, organize some kind of online workshops or media analysis or other multiple methods. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. And then Angie's question, which you might have also already seen, Brigham, was, have you reached out to the Columbia types on this? And if you need Angie to amplify on what you mean by the Columbia types, I'm sure she'd be happy to do so.
Angie, I have not reached out to the Columbia types, so I'm not sure what who the Columbia types are or what we're referring to. So,
yeah, well, that's why I threw in chat because I saw we were getting close to the end, so I figured you could. So,
right.
The Columbia types I was thinking about are the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, and I think they have. It's just not my thing. It's actually a little bit more Shacklefordish. But I think I just wonder how much pandemic and disaster preparedness comes together, I guess, because when I look at your map, I agree with Tanya. So I was in New Orleans right before Katrina. Nobody was surprised who lived there, what ended up happening. And so I wonder how much these two, disaster and pandemic mirror impacts on similar populations. And I don't find your map, unfortunately, I don't find your map surprising, which makes me very, very sad. But as someone who lived in the South for an awful long time, nope, sorry. Much, yeah, tragically sorry, but yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Brigham, take those in whatever way and order you want to.
Well, I will say one of the things that I mentioned that there's a number of different papers that are coming out of this. Some of these questions are very much related to one of the other papers that deals with the issue of trust. I do think that one of the findings that wasn't in this paper, but we put together a big survey in September and October. We're going to field it again in a month or so. But one of the questions we asked people is if they plan to get the vaccination. And we asked them a whole bunch of other questions. Then we tried to find if there were correlations between the questions. And one of the things that we found is that probably the best predictor we had about whether or not somebody would get the vaccination is if they answered, yes, I trust the government. If you answer, no, I don't trust the government, that's going to be a big problem. And I think that one of the things that is interesting or very, very challenging, interesting in a challenging way, I mean, very challenging, is there was very much a partisan bend to this question. People on the left tended to trust government more than those on the right. But I think that with a new president, that may be even exacerbated more. To Brian's question, Brian's always challenging me to look at things in a different way, which I appreciate and love. I'm grateful for that. I don't know. We may drill down more on this. I mean, part of this is we started out with a project and we're now like 4 or 5, 6 papers in deep, and I'm not sure how much more rigor we have to throw at this, but I do agree that there's different ways that you could look at this to get at different problems. It looks like I'm getting close on time. I would love, Angie, to get this contact information from you. I haven't looked at this myself. I would be surprised if my colleague Lisa Grosson has. I think she'd probably know what you're referring to, but I want to at least make sure I can follow up with this. But I just want to thank you all. I realize I'm now at the hour, and it's just been a delight. So thank you.
Brigham, it's been our pleasure. We really, really appreciate it. I saw Angie nod and give a thumbs up that she'll follow up with you about that. Scott, any closing thoughts? You want to take us out here?
Just a note of appreciation, Brigham. That was fantastic. And I do know some more of those types as well, so I'd be happy to help follow up too. But this was just fantastic. And thank you again for moderating, Bill. Wonderful discussion, everybody. Remember the research series on Wednesday. Well, we'll be inviting Sasha to join us. So that's going to be great. And hope you all have a wonderful rest of your days. Be safe. Be well.
Bye, everyone.